Picture this. It's 705 AD, deep inside the Imperial Palace in Chang'an, and Lady Wang, one of the most powerful women in the Tang Dynasty court, is being dragged into a private chamber by palace guards. She's not being led to a sword, not to a noose, not to poison. Instead, they're bringing out rolls of wet silk. Beautiful, luxurious silk. The same material that once adorned her body in elegant robes, now about to become her nightmare. And here's the thing that'll make your blood run cold. This method of torture was designed exclusively for China's most privileged, most refined women. Not peasants, not criminals off the street, only aristocratic ladies who knew the touch of luxury their entire lives. Because what I'm about to tell you is a story that's been deliberately buried by historians for over 13 centuries. And by the end of this, you'll understand why noble women would literally beg, actually beg, to be killed by sword rather than wrapped in a silk cocoon. So before we dive into the absolute horror of what happened in those palace chambers, let me tell you exactly what you're about to discover. First, I'm going to reveal why this torture method was reserved only for aristocratic women, and why that targeting was so deliberate and so calculated. Second, you're going to learn the twisted psychological reason this was considered worse than death itself. And trust me, when you understand the mental warfare involved, you'll never look at luxury the same way again. And third, I'm going to show you how one of China's most powerful empresses weaponized this torture to systematically eliminate her political enemies while maintaining her pristine public image. This is history that's been hidden from mainstream education for over 300 years. And honestly, once you hear it, you'll understand exactly why. So if you're ready to go down this rabbit hole with me, make sure you wolfie or subscribe, because what you're about to hear is something you won't find in any standard history textbook. Let's set the scene properly. We're talking about the Tang Dynasty, which ruled China from 618 to 907 AD. This was China's actual golden age, people. The Silk Road was pumping unprecedented wealth into the empire. Poetry and arts were flourishing like never before. And here's what's crucial. This was the first time in Chinese history where women could actually hold real positions of power. Female court officials, influential consorts, even businesswomen controlling major trade operations. The irony is absolutely devastating, because the very material that symbolized this newfound power, silk, became the instrument of their destruction. The same threads that represented their elevated status would literally be used to crush the life out of them. But we need to understand something fundamental about Tang Dynasty society to grasp why this torture was so uniquely devastating. Social status wasn't just about wealth, it was about honor, about dignity, about what they called maintaining face. For aristocratic women especially, their reputation was literally more valuable than their actual lives. Confucian philosophy had embedded this idea that a woman's virtue was her family's most precious asset. High-ranking court ladies built their entire identity around being the embodiment of elegance, refinement, and moral superiority. Their whole existence revolved around presenting this flawless image of civilized perfection. So imagine being one of these women, wrapped in the finest silks, your every movement calculated to display grace and status. Now keep that image in your mind as I tell you what happened when that same silk became a weapon. Here's how the torture actually worked, and I'm warning you, this gets extremely dark. Step 1. Complete and total nakedness. Now you might think that's just standard torture procedure, but for an aristocratic woman in Tang Dynasty China, this wasn't just physical exposure. This was the obliteration of identity. These women had spent their entire lives carefully clothed in layers upon layers of silk robes. Being stripped bare wasn't just humiliating, it was an assault on everything they believed made them who they were. But that was just the psychological warm-up. Step 2. The wrapping begins. Executioners would take strips of the finest quality silk, and this detail is important. The same expensive, luxurious fabric these women wore in their daily lives. The material they literally slept on, the symbol of their elevated status. They'd soak it in water until it was completely saturated, heavy, cold, and clinging. Then they'd start at the feet and wrap upward, toe to ankle, ankle to knee, knee to thigh, layer after layer after layer. Wrapping around the torso, the chest making breathing slightly harder with each revolution, then the arms, pinning them against the body, then finally around the neck, leaving only the face exposed. Now here's where the true horror of this method reveals itself. Silk has this property where when it's wet, it's flexible and relatively loose, but as it dries, it contracts. It tightens, slowly, methodically, inevitably. And this process takes hours. The victim isn't dying in minutes. They're lying there, completely conscious, feeling the fabric gradually transform from something soft into something that feels like iron bands slowly closing around every inch of their body. It's like being slowly squeezed by a fabric python that never stops constricting. The historical accounts describe how victims could feel their fingers turning blue first, the sex, in their arms as circulation got cut off section by section. Their breathing became more labored as the silk around their chest contracted further and further. And the psychological torture of it, watching this symbol of your wealth and power slowly, methodically crush the life out of you while you're completely helpless to stop it. But it gets worse, because there were actually 3 variations of this torture, each one more horrifying than the last, and each one specifically designed to target what made aristocratic women distinct in Tang society. So let me break down exactly why this method was exclusively reserved for the elite. The core purpose wasn't just to kill someone. Execution methods in ancient China were brutal across the board: beheading, strangulation, death by 1,000 cuts, burning. But those were used on everyone from peasants to nobles. Silk torture was different because its purpose was the complete destruction of social identity. Think about it. Aristocratic women in Tang China weren't just people. They were symbols. Symbols of refined civilization, of Confucian virtue, of the empire's cultural superiority. These women represented the highest achievements of society. Educated, artistic, morally upright pillars of respectability. So when the state wanted to not just kill a woman but destroy everything she represented, they used her own status symbol against her. This is psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. Throughout their entire lives, silk meant safety, luxury, beauty, power. From childhood, these women were taught that silk robes marked them as superior, as protected by their status. The texture of silk against their skin was a constant reminder of who they were. Now imagine every single one of those associations being corrupted in the most visceral way possible. That safety becomes suffocation. That luxury becomes a death sentence. That beauty becomes the instrument of destruction. The state wasn't just executing a person. They were systematically dismantling every positive association with the very thing that defined aristocratic femininity. Compare this to traditional execution. A beheading is quick, violent, final, but it doesn't strip away your dignity layer by layer. With silk torture, the method itself was designed to make the victim experience the betrayal of everything they trusted. And here's the part that makes it even more calculated. Other aristocratic women were often forced to watch. Can you imagine being a court lady, wrapped in your own silk robes, watching another woman of your exact social class being killed by the very material you're currently wearing? The message was crystal clear. Your wealth can't protect you, your status means nothing, and the greatest symbol of your power can become your destroyer in an instant. Now let me tell you about the woman who turned this into a political weapon with surgical precision. Empress Wu Zetian ruled China from 690 to 705 AD, and she remains the only woman in Chinese history to hold the title of emperor, not empress, emperor. And Wu had a unique problem. How do you eliminate female rivals without looking like you're threatened by other women? Because if she used traditional execution methods on noble ladies, it would look weak, like she was insecure about other powerful women. But if she could frame the torture as punishment for moral corruption, for betraying the very virtues that aristocratic women were supposed to embody, then she wasn't just removing threats, she was positioning herself as the defender of proper feminine virtue. It was the perfect crime. Wu would identify noble ladies who were gaining too much influence, fabricate charges of adultery or treason, and then order the silk torture. The method itself sent the message: you betrayed what silk represents: refinement, virtue, loyalty. So now silk will destroy you. And the genius of it was that Wu never had to personally appear cruel or vindictive. The torture method itself carried the moral weight of the accusation. Plus, the sheer terror this created meant she could control potentially rebellious noble families without executing dozens of people. The fear of silk torture kept potential rivals in line more effectively than any army. Let me give you a specific example that shows just how ruthless this system was. In 695 AD, a woman named Lady Zhang, who was married to the crown prince, was accused of gaining too much influence with court officials. She wasn't plotting rebellion, she wasn't committing treason, She was just becoming too popular, too influential, too much of a potential threat to Wu's control. Historical records preserved Lady Zhong's final words, and they're absolutely heartbreaking. She said, "I have served the empire faithfully, upheld every virtue expected of my station, and now I die in shame. Wrapped in the very symbol of honor I spent my life maintaining." Wu's response: "Silk reveals true nature. If you were as virtuous as you claimed, it would embrace you gently." It's absolutely chilling. Lady Zhong's execution took 14 hours, from the first wrapping until her final breath. And here's what really demonstrates the psychological warfare aspect. Wu required all the court ladies to attend and watch for the first 4 hours as a lesson in virtue. Can you imagine being forced to stand there, in your silk robes, watching another woman your age, your social class, your exact situation, slowly suffocate in material identical to what you're wearing? The trauma alone would be enough to ensure absolute obedience. But Wu didn't just use silk torture for political rivals, she used it to psychologically condition the entire court. The threat was more powerful than the actual execution, because once everyone knew this method existed, the fear did the work for her. There are records of Wu using it on her own daughter-in-law when she felt the younger woman was becoming too independent. That's the level of control we're talking about. Now let me explain why historians who study this method call it a psychological masterpiece. And I use that term loosely because it's more like a masterpiece of horror. The victim remains conscious for most of the 6 to 18-hour process. They can feel every single fiber tightening. They know exactly how they're going to die, and they're completely powerless to stop it. There's a preserved account from a Buddhist monastery that recorded the words of a victim who somehow survived the initial stages before being pardoned. She described being able to count individual threads and feeling the moment each section of her body lost sensation, predicting with accuracy when she would lose feeling in her hands, then her arms, then her chest. The torture wasn't just physical, it was the weaponization of anticipation. Some historical accounts describe how the silk would tighten in waves, faster when the air was dry, slower when humidity increased, so victims never knew if the next moment would bring relief or increased agony. They'd feel a slight loosening as someone walked by with water, breathing moisture into the air, then feel it constrict again as the room dried. It was hope and despair alternating in a rhythm designed to break the mind before the body finally gave out. And remember, this entire time, the victim is looking at pure white silk, the color of innocence and virtue in Chinese culture, slowly killing them. The symbolism was the weapon as much as the physical mechanism. Historical records show that aristocratic women who were given the choice between different execution methods would beg for literally anything else. Sword? Yes, please. Axe? Absolutely. Even burning was preferable because at least it would be over relatively quickly. There's a documented case of a Lady Chen who, when told she would face silk torture, literally pleaded to die as a warrior, not as prey caught in a spider's web. She was denied. The psychological devastation was so effective that the method created trauma in people who merely witnessed it. Court ladies who attended these executions reportedly had nightmares for years, would flinch at the touch of silk, some even requested to wear only cotton, despite the massive social stigma that came with refusing silk garments. That's how deep the psychological scarring went. When the Tang Dynasty finally fell in 907 AD, one of the first things the new dynasty did was ban this specific torture method, not because they thought it was inhumane. Ancient China had plenty of brutal execution methods that continued, but because they recognized how psychologically effective it was and didn't want it used against their own aristocratic families. But here's where the story gets even more fascinating. The method didn't just stop being used, it was actively scrubbed from history. New dynasties explicitly banned even talking about it in detail. Buddhist philosophy, which was gaining influence, emphasized that suffering should serve a purpose, either justice or enlightenment. Silk torture served neither. It existed purely for psychological destruction, and that made it philosophically problematic for a society trying to position itself as morally evolved. So by 960 AD, the method had vanished so completely that historians actually questioned whether it had ever really existed, or was just a legend created to make Wu Zetian look worse. It wasn't until the 1970s, when monastery records from the Tang period were discovered and translated, that historians confirmed this was absolutely real, documented, and used systematically. The records included detailed descriptions, victim testimonies, and even the specific measurements of silk strips used. It wasn't myth, it was historical fact that had been deliberately buried. So what does this tell us? The silk torture represents something profound about how societies use symbols against people. It wasn't just about killing threatening women, it was about weaponizing beauty, luxury, and status against anyone who challenged the established order. The most refined, the most civilized, the most elegant material in Chinese culture was twisted into an instrument of control. And that pattern repeats throughout history. The very things that supposedly represent our elevation and refinement are the same things that can be turned against us when we become inconvenient to power. The psychological principles that made silk torture effective, turning someone's source of pride into their prison, corrupting their sense of safety, making them witness their own destruction slowly and consciously, these tactics didn't disappear with the Tang Dynasty. They just evolved. Modern oppression might not use literal silk, but the strategy of weaponizing identity, using someone's own status against them, turning their strengths into vulnerabilities, that's still happening. Whether it's social media shaming, economic manipulation, or political intimidation, the core tactic remains. Take what someone values about themselves and make it the instrument of their suffering. And maybe that's why this story was buried for so long. Because when you really understand how silk torture worked, you start recognizing the pattern everywhere. You see how systems of power consistently identify what makes people feel safe, dignified, and valued, then systematically corrupt those exact things to maintain control. It's uncomfortable to acknowledge that the most refined, civilized surfaces of society often hide the darkest mechanisms of oppression. So yeah, that's the forgotten history of Chinese silk torture. A method so psychologically devastating that an entire civilization tried to erase it from memory. A torture designed exclusively for aristocratic women because it targeted not just their bodies, but their entire social identity. A weapon wielded by China's only female emperor to eliminate threats while maintaining her image as a defender of virtue. And a historical lesson in how the most beautiful things in any culture can be twisted into instruments of control when challenging the wrong people. Makes you wonder what other refined, elegant torture methods have been conveniently forgotten throughout history, doesn't it? What other brutal truths are hiding behind the civilized surfaces of historical societies? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear about the medieval European torture methods designed specifically for queens and noblewomen that make silk torture look merciful by comparison, make sure you're subscribed because that's coming next. History's most beautiful surfaces hide its darkest secrets, and we're just getting started.